Okay, welcome to dis&dat, 28 March 2025. Going to do more Marxism and Law today on the autonomouscollective.net. I tacked it on to yesterday's little reading, which I knew I wasn't going to get to the end of because I'd introduced, for a variety of reasons, Lenin talking about Marxism. In particular, Section 3 of Economic Doctrine, which essentially compresses some of the things that actually Kautsky says. So it's not, um, despite the uh, antagonism between Kautsky and Lenin, it's pretty clear that Kautsky was sort of still there, and which is one of the raison d'etre for doing theories of surplus value, but that's for another day. Although that's what what I'm thinking of planning for. On the one hand, it gets me out of trying to assemble content for dis&dat and weekly marks. So essentially, weekly marks and content is going to be filled up for a couple of months. That is, we're going to try and finish on Sundays, weekly marks at 3 p.m. with we're going to get to the end of Karl Marx's Volume 1, 2024 version, the Princeton University translation, and with the two Pauls. And on Saturdays, I've decided we're going to begin this Saturday with the preface to the latest or last version of, because I'm sure there's going to be a better one. Of Theories of Surplus Value, the 2013 edition. And even though I think it was put up on the internet on 2011, in 2011. So that's what we'll begin. It's a 1,000-page document, so we're going to be there on Saturdays for a while. And if I were smart, I'd pre-record everything, but no, I kind of like maybe people will actually get interested in it. The advantage of that particular document is there's less math. In fact, almost no math in it, which is good for at least people to, stand that kind of reading. And of course, it's available on the internet, so you don't have to worry about finding it. And I think similarly that will happen to the Princeton Volume 1. So we'll tackle interesting things on Saturdays, like why is it that it is or isn't Volume 4 of Capital? That's a minor issue, but along with Volume 1 on Sundays, which will get us hopefully up to the CSSGJ Andy Higginbottom lectures, which will begin in the fall on Volume 3 of Capital. So there's still a lot to do in weekly marks on the weekends, and so I think I've filled the content requirement, whatever it is, for that. All right, today, this is a review from the Cornell Law Review. It's on a book written in 1982 by Hugh Collins on Marxism and Law. Good book, among many others. But the reason why it's notable is that, of course, it happens in the acme of the period of critique of law that occurred at the elite law schools, primarily. I mean, actually at Harvard and Yale. It was part of the critical legal studies movement, which has its own issues and created other kinds of points of view that have, of course, become interestingly problematic. For example, um, uh, critical CBT or whatever the hell it is sort of a symptom of that, or whatever, is a result of trying to think about what would be an Afrocentric version of critical legal studies, and that's kind of what happened. And of course, it was used as a scapegoat because no one ever taught it uh, except in law schools. And I don't think that there are any children who go to law school, so that is the usual stupidity of the right wing. But anyway, here we go. Marxism as metaphor, a Marxist analysis of law, claims that a reasonably systematic relation exists between the law and the relations of production, with the latter more or less determining the former. Such an analysis faces three linked difficulties, which I will call the problem of mechanism, the problem of law as constitutive, and the problem of reification. So all these terms, are fairly clear. The problem of mechanism is the one that most non-Marxists latch onto most easily. They say that a Marxist analysis must claim that in a capitalist society, law serves the interests of the ruling class. Yet we all know that judges are formally independent of class pressures, haha, that they only occasionally say that they're acting to promote class interests and that their social ties to the ruling class are loose enough to make it implausible that the judges are instruments of the ruling class. Judge Alito and his salmon from Alaska, and Clarence Thomas's bus. If all this is so, the non-Marxist asks, well, how then does the coincidence between law and ruling class interests come about? The problem of law as constitutive mainly arises within the Marxist camp. In its simplest version, the problem arises because class relations are defined in terms of which class owns the means of production, and yet ownership is a legal category that takes on its meaning only because of its relation to all other available legal categories. Law thus seems to define or constitute class relations, in which case it is circular to say that the relations of production somehow determine the law. So if that's so, how then is a Marxist analysis of law possible? The problem of reification is the peculiar American contribution to the discussion because of the strong influence of legal realism on American thought about law. One might say, using the scientific terminology to which some Marxists are attracted, that we must specify carefully the dependent variable, that is, law, in the analysis. Most Marxists seem to want to say that a rule of law, the fellow-servant rule, is a classic example, that a rule of law serves class interests. Yet the legal realists taught us that there was never a fellow-servant rule that could be a dependent variable to be explained in terms of its links to the economic base. There were and always are rules and counter-rules, rules with exceptions of such scope as to threaten the rule itself, rules whose force can be eliminated by drawing creatively on analogies to apparently unrelated areas of law, and so on. Statutes, too, have to be interpreted and fit into a whole legal universe and cannot be understood as a series of words whose meaning is fixed at the time of enactment. Then what then can a Marxist analysis try to analyze? Hugh Collins's superb book, Marxism Law, is a sympathetic explication of what a sensible Marxist analysis might be. It confronts directly the problems of mechanism and of law as constitutive and gives answers that seem satisfactory on Collins's level of discussion, although the answers weaken the claim that Marxists have a special way of analyzing the law. Collins repeatedly notices the problem of reification, but does not give an answer. Indeed, he seems to view reification as inherent in the Marxist program and criticizes efforts to avoid reification as inconsistent with Marxism. Now, he may be correct in the sense that avoiding reification may, but only may, deprive the analysis of any specifically Marxist content. Number one, the problem of mechanism. After an introductory chapter explaining why Marxists reject legal fetishism, the view that the law is an essential component of social order, and seek an image of reality undistorted by that view, Collins discusses the fundamental Marxist argument that law is essentially superstructural, dependent for its form and content upon determining forces emanating from the economic base of society. Now, he rejects the theory, which he calls class instrumentalism, that law directly reflects the interests of the ruling class. While such a theory may have something to say about the laws regulating the relations of production, it is totally implausible as an explanation of such things as the details of, for example, family law. According to Collins, class instrumentalism fails on three grounds. It is often impossible to link a legal rule to any aspect of the relations of production. Some laws are deliberate attempts to change minor aspects of the relations of production and therefore cannot reflect them. And most important, there is no account of how conscious action is determined by the material basis. Now, that last ground is the problem of mechanism. One mechanism is conscious awareness of class interests. The law would reflect the interests of the ruling class if lawmakers knew their class interests and enacted them into law. Collins agrees that just as class instrumentalism may account for some aspects of the law, conscious choice may be the mechanism linking law and class interests in some case. He argues, however, that lawmakers are not always, perhaps never know what constitutes the long-term interests of the ruling class. An alternative theory, which allows subjective perceptions to diverge from objective class interests, leaves law as a, quote, loose collection of rules produced by the fluctuating forces of diverse political groups, unquote, within the ruling class, whose diversity rests not on differences in interests, but only on differences in perception. Collins concludes that conscious awareness is a logically unsatisfactory answer to the problem of mechanism. Quote, either there has to be an account of how motivations inevitably coincide with a person's objective class position, or it has to be explained how the social class comes to share a common perception of interests. This gap of logic is filled by a theory of ideology which not only strengthens the conscious awareness answer, but provides an alternative answer to the problem of mechanism. For Collins, ideology is formed by a process of socialization in which people acquire a set of signs and categories with which they interpret the world. Ideology is the way that people make sense of their experiences and the means by which experiences that are painful and unsettling become natural. Oh, that DEI. The pain of alienation is transmitted into the residued, or joyous acceptance of the naturalness of an individualistic market economy. Law plays an important ideological role because it is encountered frequently in daily life and provides a comprehensive interpretation and evaluation of social relationships and events which is in tune with the main themes in the dominant ideology. Collins is, of course, aware that in tune with is a long way from is determined by. The difficulty is that the dominant ideology is so open that almost anything can be in tune with it. Collins argues that Marxists can respond to the openness of ideology in one of two ways. They can, quote, limit their claims to manageable proportions, unquote, and argue that they will explain only, quote, the broad outlines of social evolution, unquote. Now, this solution, Collins correctly states, is unpalatable to many Marxists because it means that their theory will have nothing to say about the class struggles that they see all around them, unquote. The alternative is to emphasize the plasticity and omnipresence of the dominant ideology. See Twitter. Through this emphasis, Marxists are able to make some sense of the experience of analysts of law, that things happen, decisions are made, laws are enacted which seem to be the product of guild interests on the part of lawyers or which seem to have little connection to the relations of production. The vehicle in Marxist theory for this sense is the concept of relative autonomy. Recall that this is the period of, Althusser, etc. Collins struggles hard to make sense of this concept as a tool of Marxist analysis, concluding that in its best form, relative autonomy means that the dominant ideology produces the underlying categories and values of the legal system, but through a logical process, judges articulate the precise implications of these forms. Yet Collins points out this formulation threatens any illuminating materialist explanation of the content of law. If judges have an autonomous power to manipulate underlying categories, what prevents them from doing so in ways that, quote, alter the basic principles through legal reasoning, unquote. Collins summarizes, if Marxists stick to a purely instrumental explanation of legal reasoning, then the whole enterprise of ensuring coherence and consistency in legal reasoning has to be dismissed as false consciousness, perpetuated by lawyers who are concerned to mystify their desire to support the interests of the ruling class. On the other hand, an acceptance of the autonomy thesis poses a threat to the whole theory of historical materialism. Marxists, it would seem, have a choice between presenting a false picture of reality or being un-Marxist. Collins suggests that, once again, ideology offers the way out. The apparent autonomy of legal reasoning is an ideology that makes sense out of the experience of openness and flexibility within the legal system. Quote, lawyers are concerned with coherence and consistency because they're attempting to resolve conflicting interpretations of the dominant ideology, unquote, which is open and flexible. But now Collins closes a trap. Because of the plasticity of the dominant ideology, it is possible to eliminate any counterexamples without difficulty. On a Popperian view of science, which I take many Marxists hold, this makes the Marxist analysis of law unscientific. Collins concludes that instrumentalism must be rejected because it's unfaithful to the Marxist explanation of ideologies. Now, this is all, this is where the Frankfurt School goes, right? But that an ideological explanation that emphasizes the plasticity of the dominant ideology must also fail because it cannot connect the relations of production to the content of law. Notice, however, that Collins appears to require that a Marxist analysis of law provide an explanation of the content of the law. As I have suggested, Collins discusses plastic ideologies because he wants to avoid the unpalatable limitation of Marxist analysis to broad historical developments. Similarly, he concludes that his discussion of ideology by acknowledging that this criticism loses force if we're willing to limit the scope of the theory and thereby leave, quote, large gaps in the account of laws, unquote. I will argue below that such a limitation is necessary, not to preserve the distinctly Marxist elements of the analysis, but to make it minimally coherent. The problem of reification is another version of the question of scope to which Collins attends. Solving it may rescue the Marxist project, although perhaps at a cost unacceptable to many Marxists. Remember, this is 1982, 83. The problem of law as constitutive, this is part two, the three principal things that the review wants to deal with. Now, how can one simultaneously believe all of the following propositions to be true? Number one, the base determines, in some weak or strong sense, the superstructure. That's number one. Number two, law is an element of the superstructure, right? We all remember the little pyramid, right? Three, the base consists of the relations of production. And number four, relations of production are defined in terms of ownership of the means of production. Legal terms seem to constitute the base, but that is what supposedly determines them. So, obviously a problem. Collins's chapter on this issue focuses, as it must, remember, other people talking about Jerry G.A. Cohen's masterly contribution. This is historical materialism and a whole bunch of other things that one might call analytic Marxism. Cohen argues that we must define relations of production in terms of physical power over the means of production. This may not work, Cohen concedes, when a mode of production has matured and physical power has acquired normative value by its recognition in law. But in a period of transformation, we can see how physical power and legally recognized ownership do not coincide. Collins objects cogently, I believe, that somehow during such periods, power and ownership have to be brought into harmony. Drawing on his earlier analysis, Collins argues that ideology provides the mechanism by which this harmonization occurs. Everybody goes to the same church, right? But if that is so, Cohen can no longer hinge his solution to the problem of law as constitutive to periods of transformation. Ideologies are groups of ideas that take a long time to develop and acquire normative and persuasive content through sustained struggles between those favored by existing ideologies and those seeking to institute new ones. It's the permanent conflict between conservative Catholics and evangelical Protestants. A dominant ideology with the potential to shape a social formation could only arise from settled social practices where norms of behavior had established a degree of regularity of behavior within which persistent conceptions of the world could emerge. This ideology could not arise from the kind of transitory power relations by which Cohen characterizes the material base. This is the problem of, Trump trying to force the Smithsonian Institution to eliminate black people from its content. This analysis of Cohen's thesis seems correct to me. Collins proceeds to offer a different solution to the problem, a solution that resembles the legal anthropologist's notion of law as a double institutionalization of regularities in behavior into social norms and then into enforceable rules, return of Jim Crow. Collins argues that as a mode of production develops in the womb of an earlier one, Marx might have said, segments of the community, that is, nascent class fragments, Poulantzas might have said, interact in patterned ways that rest on their relations to the means of production. Now, because people need ways of thinking that make sense of their lives, they begin to treat these patterns as norms. When the new mode of production replaces the old, these norms are converted into legal rules. Darn civil rights. Thus, the legal rules come to constitute the base by a process of social development and class struggle through the struggle for ideological domination in the preceding period. Darn those elections. The argument works neatly up to this point when it's combined with Collins's earlier arguments about the plasticity of a dominant ideology. However, it devastates his effort to make sense of a Marxist analysis of law that does not have large gaps in the account of laws. Now, to demonstrate this, I must depart from the close tracking that I've given of Collins's arguments and jump to his final chapter. In that chapter, Collins turns from theory to practice and asks, how might a Marxist use law in the class struggle? Quote, the radical's predicament, unquote, is that the tactical use of law for short-term ends may validate the ideal with law within bourgeois society, enhance the ideological underpinnings of class rule, and thus impede rather than promote revolutionary change in the long run. Now, this occurs because the capitalist mode of production supports and requires only a neutral state to protect property and enforce contracts. Now, according to Collins, what is needed is a program for the demystification of the neutrality of the liberal political order and its replacement by an appreciation of the class structure of government. Such a program must be pragmatic, sometimes using law, to heighten class consciousness by securing laws that increase the opportunities for a working class movement to gain cohesion, sometimes foregoing apparent reforms as sufficiently demystifying. I have my doubts about the efficacy of a tactical use of law, which the ruling class may readily describe as a cynical manipulation of the uncohesive working class, thereby preventing an increase in cohesion. But suppose that we treat Collins' statements not as a political program for Marxists, but as the basis for analyzing the specific content of law in capitalist society. Given that class struggle for Marxists is endemic, although not always self-conscious, and given a relatively open ideology of the sort that Collins describes, the laws as they are at any moment must be seen as the product of the class struggle at that moment. Reforms are extracted from unwilling segments of the ruling class by pressure from the working class, enhanced by those leading segments of the bourgeoisie that understand how reform may preserve capitalism. Conversely, repressive laws are imposed by the ruling class on a working class too weak to resist. Now, consider Collins' solution to the problem of law as constitutive. Regularities of behavior are also negotiated through the class struggle. The particular social norms that embody these regularities ratify the outcome of the class struggle, and the laws that come to constitute the base institutionalize the success of the ruling class. In sum, Collins says that the Marxists may escape the circularity of law as constitutive only by developing an empty analytic theory that states no more than that particular laws are explained by the state of the class struggle. Marxists, therefore, must relinquish the project of developing a reasonably comprehensive Marxist analysis of law. So you can conclude, perhaps, in this second section that it is about strategy rather than tactics. Number three, the problem of reification. I have argued that in dealing with the first two problems of mechanism and law as constitutive, Collins leaves Marxism with a serious problem concerning the proper scope of its analysis of law. He argues that a reasonably comprehensive theory will be empty insofar as it emphasizes the plasticity of ideology, and I have suggested, thus argues, in effect, that Marxism has an empty theory of how the base is constituted by law. Now, it may be possible, however, to have a Marxist analysis of law that makes less comprehensive claims than Collins requires of the analysis that he elucidates. In a chapter entitled The Prognosis for Law, Collins touches on this possibility of a more limited Marxist analysis. His discussion is shaped by the utopian vision of a communist society in which the state, and presumably the law as well, will have withered away. That is the point of Soviet law, needless to say, originally, if you read Pashakanis. I must confess that when the issue is phrased in that way, it strikes me that the ensuing discussion is likely to be highly idealistic and illuminating. Although it must be noted that the wrong answer cost Yevgeny Pashakanis, the leading philosopher of the law in the 1920s, his life during the terror of the 1930s. Now, Pashakanis developed the commodity exchange theory of law. According to this theory, Marx discovered how the fetishism of commodities worked by presenting to everyone in bourgeois society the image of commodities stripped of the labor power that produces them. Commodity fetishism lets us treat as fungible all the diverse products of diverse human labor by reducing them to a common unit of labor power. But commodities cannot be exchanged in the market without human participation, making it necessary to supplement the economic relationship among commodities with a legal relationship among people. This is the hinge of contract. This legal relationship corresponds to, and in some versions is derived from, the reduction of diverse human labor to a uniform unit of labor power. For in the legal sphere, law reduces all the diverse relations of social life to relations among legally indistinguishable individuals. That's the kind of internationalism combined in the Code of Capital, for example. Thus, what links law to the material base is the parallel between commodities present themselves to us and the way that we conceive of our relations to each other. In the currently fashionable terminology, the commodity exchange theory of law would have Marxism explain the form of law, but not its content. Now, that may be taking it a little too far, but it's an interesting claim. The commodity exchange theory avoids one version of the problem of reification. In my discussion so far, I've been careful to talk of law in a relatively undifferentiated way. The problem of reification arises when one tries to analyze specific rules or doctrines and link them to the material base, which is the comprehensive project that Collins attributes to Marxism. Now, the difficulty is that, as the realists taught us, the legal realists taught us, there are no specific rules or doctrines. Note that legal realism opposes itself to various other kinds of things, textual or originalism or all other stuff. There are results in particular cases which the judges rationalize by invoking or creating a rule. The Roberts Court. But there are always alternative rules that could have been invoked to yield a different result, and alternative rationalizations of the same result that invoke still other rules. Now, one does not have to believe, as I do, that this indeterminacy is total to understand that indeterminacy of any significant degree will doom the comprehensive project. Not only will it be clear that the result could have been different, so that the link between the rule invoked and the material base would be entirely adventitious, but the rule itself could have been different, so that the link that is supposed to explain things would have to be reconstructed entirely ad hoc. Now, Collins criticizes Pashakanis for trying to explain all legal rules as a reflection of commodity exchange. The realist argument shows that such an effort cannot succeed. The commodity exchange theory, however, need not involve that effort. Instead, it could try to explain only the general form of legal relationships in bourgeois society. Now, another version of the problem of reification, however, then arises. As Collins states the matter, bourgeois legal systems are described as sets of general abstract rules of universal application. I doubt whether this is a fair description of many parts of modern legal systems, unquote. He notes that in many fields, especially those involving the regulatory state characteristic of contemporary capitalism, the quote, the overwhelming characteristic of the regulations seems to be their attention to minute detail rather than abstract principle. Yes and no. One could discount this observation, as Klaus Offe does, OFFE, by treating the detail of regulatory laws as a contradiction within later developed capitalist laws, which has been generated in turn by the contradictions of capitalism. This, you can see this in mergers and acquisitions, perhaps. A realist would say, however, that generality and abstraction are themselves always masks for minutely particularized decisions. The stated rules, when seen in the realist, it's seen as the realist insists that they must be seen in the precise context in which they are applied, are what philosophers might call definite descriptions. This, however, makes the commodity exchange theory all the more interesting because it attempts to explain why the appeal to generality and abstraction is so potent that legal decision makers always try to use it, are embarrassed when they are forced to particularize, see minutely detailed regulations as a threat to the rule of law, and reject the realist argument fairly violently. Collins criticizes the theory, but insofar as it tries to be comprehensive. Now, Collins has shown that the only candidate for a viable Marxist theory is one that deals with the form and not the content of the law. The commodity exchange theory is the leading, perhaps the only contender of that sort. This is worth more research. Collins, however, has not shown, like the other theorists or the other theories, it will not work. Conclusion. A Marxist theory of the legal form may be impossible. One might construct a theoretical entity called the legal form, but that entity never appears in any real bourgeois society. Instead, as Collins's example of regulatory law indicates, all real societies are not pure versions of a mode of production and what it may entail, but social formations in which elements of various modes of production coexist. That's uneven development, if you will recall. To analyze societies using abstract categories may be possible, but only because one makes some obviously problematic epistemological assumptions. Contemporary Marxists are in general committed to those assumptions. Every instinct I have tells me that they're wrong, but I'm not qualified to reject those assumptions out of hand. Several more decades of argument. Yet, even if the epistemological assumptions are wrong, and even if a Marxist analysis of law of the sort that I've discussed is impossible, something still remains to be said. In one sense, Marxism is the only remaining secular view that is committed to fighting domination wherever it occurs. Considered in that light, the debate over the withering away of law takes on a new aspect. Law may be taken as a metaphor for all those facets of our social relationships that seem to us necessary for us to get along in the world, and that also seem somehow imposed on us. Marxism is then a metaphor for a world of radical contingency, in which we know that social regularities are constructed by our own actions, have no life of their own, and may be challenged and reconstructed whenever and however we want. In that world, however, what do we do about the Charles Mansons and the David Rockefellers? This is a Mark V. Tushnet doing the review, and a professor of law in the 80s at Georgetown. Is that it's worth rereading, if only to give you a kind of perspective on what Marxist approaches to law represent or represented. It's pretty clear that that's not the way it operates, for example, in the post-Soviet Union Russia, nor really in the current decades of the People's Republic of China, to use big examples. I think that these are important ways in which we have to consider what were the original kind of ideas of a communist law, for example, which are not identical to a Marxist theory of law, which is that whole opposition between sort of, Comintern and blah, 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 Western Marxism and all the things that we've been fiddling around with, the need to go look back at Stalin, the need to, consider everything in their, all of these little historical oppositions that sit within the larger framework of historical materialism. Anyway, these and also Jessup's the reference to Jessup here is important. People should read Jessup. A- anyway, um, so I repeated it here in a different form from the PDF, so that's just repeated here below. And then I've included a link to the LPE Law and Political Economy Field Guide, a brief reading list. It's a good reading list. Includes, uh, well, there's maybe a manifesto somewhere in there. And there's a problem. Certainly, the reason why I never, did law school is, the lawyering is certainly ugly, ugly business, and yet we get to see it all the time. And political economy, where is the political economy? This is that whole. It's not just base superstructure; it's much bigger than that, or more complicated. And then, of course, for a deeper dive, see building a law and political economy framework beyond the 20th century synthesis. See, it's sort of acknowledging the critical legal studies roots and law and political economy in a time of accelerating crises, which is exactly where we are now. And needless to say, significant work on environmental law is important, as well as all the usual issues of human rights and et cetera, and the critiques of the legal profession and all that sort of stuff. Um, LPE branches are in pretty much every major law school, probably not in minor law schools, for the obvious ideological reasons similar to the difference between orthodox and heterodox political economy. But anyway, so that's my little yammering for today. I Let me see if there were no comments in the chat, so therefore I will stop share and return us to your regularly scheduled program. Let me stop the live stream. Uh, Tomorrow is Saturday, and we will begin our work on theories of surplus value with the preface to TSV. One which is a fraught document, but I think one needs to understand the history of the document, or the set of documents that constitute theories of surplus value, because it does have a very long and winding road made difficult for some interpreters. And you can do a fight about, well, were there supposed to be 6 volumes or 4 volumes, and why is it 3 volumes instead of 4 volumes, and all of that idiocy. But it's part of the historiography, so we're going to do that tomorrow. And I don't know if we'll get finished with it, but recall that Theories of Surplus Value, at least in the 3 volume version, is about 1,000 pages. So we'll get there one way or the other. So let me state that that's happening on Saturday. On Sunday, to remind you again, it's Karl Marx Volume 1 of Capital, the Princeton edition. We're up to chapter, oh, whatever the hell it is, 16, I think. We're going to do 2 chapters, whatever the hell it is. So take a look. It's already on Discord. So whatever.